Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Sister Paulette. Okay, so again, we want to make sure that we talk about the languages the Bible was written in. We want to make sure we say ancient Hebrew, Koine Greek, and Aramaic. Don't just say Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. It's very specific. Ancient Hebrew, Koine Greek, and Aramaic. And we did already pray before class. Also, for your homework, please do not look at the syllabus for your homework. I wrote the syllabus for this class months ago. The coursework has changed as the Lord has given me direction. So what I teach may be different from what was in the syllabus. That's why there's a little statement at the bottom of the syllabus that says subject to change. For your homework, pay attention to whatever I have taught in class and whatever is in the slides that I send out after class, please. And that's my mistake. Be sure if you make a statement in your papers for your homework, I want to see clear, concise thoughts, right? And if you make a statement that most Christians are apostolic, then I need something to back that up. Why do you say that? Where are you getting that from? You're saying most. So where are you getting that from? If you say 99% of the Jews followed Jesus during his time on earth and they believed what he said was true, then I need something to back that up. I need a quote. I need a reference of some sort. Please do not make statements you're not backing up. Why am I saying this? Because you guys are becoming great apologists, right? People are going to challenge you. If you make a statement, they're going to ask you, where did you get that information? Why do you say that? Christianity isn't that great. Jesus wasn't that great. Your Bible is flawed. It's full of lies and contradictions, right? People will challenge you. So that's why I'm telling you now, when you do your homework and you write your papers, back up the statements you're stating. This is for your edification. This is why this is mastering apologetics, okay? All right. Next, be sure to address everything that I'm asking you. So if I have 3 parts to your homework assignment, how does the God of the Bible differ from Greek and Roman gods? Are there any Greek and Roman gods listed in the Bible? Are there any mythical gods listed in the Bible? Just make sure to answer all 3 of those questions. And most of you did. I just want to make sure that you're not missing points for not addressing something. And I was lenient again with the grading this week. Most of you did address all the topics, and that was good. Some of you did make some rogue statements without backing it up. So I'm telling you now, start backing up those statements. If you say something, I want to see proof. I want to see the research behind it. I want to see why you say that. Because again, you are defending the faith. You are defending why you're a Christian. You're defending why your God is greater than these Greek and Roman gods. So we need to back up what we're saying. And if I did not, I have looked at all your papers. If I did not email you your grade, I will do that. Some of them I did not email back your grades, and that's on me. I will do that. Okay, I'll tell you, everybody got A's and B's. So there was no big issues this week. Okay, so with that, you all survived weeks 1 and 2. Week 3, I will tell you now, weeks 3 and 4, I put together in one slide deck, and I may split it up when I send it out to you tonight. So I may cut off exactly where we stopped tonight as not to give you too much information. But I will tell you right now, weeks 3 and 4 are packed with information. There's a lot of information, and I need to make somebody else the host because I just got an email from Spectrum saying something's going on with my internet. I don't even know how to do that. Oh, yes, I do. Hold on just a minute. Dr. Levika, are you still there? Because I'm going to make you the host, and I'm going to send you these slides really quickly. Okay.
That's fine. I'm here.
Okay, I'm making you the co-host. And if I get kicked out, I'm emailing you these slides right now. Excuse me, class, for just a minute. I apologize for this. They're putting down fiber in my neighborhood, and it is just a mess, to say the least. And My internet has been up and down literally all weekend. Okay, I just sent the slides. Again, I apologize. If I get kicked out, I've got a ram in the bush that's going to take over this class for me. Okay, so I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, do you all see my slides? Do a thumbs up. Nod your head. Sister Julie is not.
Cut off.
Okay, hold on.
I'm going to hit that minus key.
Okay, what about now?
Yes, I can see it now.
Okay, so again, weeks 3 and 4, packed full of information. I am telling you in advance, there's a lot of stuff here. So we're going to get right into it. Okay, so today we're going to get as much through this as we can. We're going to go and talk about autographs versus manuscripts, comparing some ancient manuscripts. We're going to talk about the canon. I'm going to tell you what the canon is. We're going to talk about textual criticism for the Old Testament and the New Testament. We're going to compare some of the text types, and we'll get into English biblical translations. We will not get through all of this tonight. We will get as far as we can, then we'll stop and we'll pick back up next week, okay? All right. Autographs versus manuscripts. What is an autograph? An autograph is the original text, the first copy of the text or the letter. You should know this. You might see this again on a test. Autographs are important. We do not currently have any of the autographs for any of the Old Testament or New Testament. Remember, autographs are the originals. We do not have that. We have discovered manuscripts. Manuscripts are handwritten copies of the scriptures. We have lots of manuscripts. This is why it is so significant about the validity and the accuracy of our Bibles because of the manuscripts. Mm-hmm. Approximately 25,000 manuscripts of the New Testament exists. That's just the New Testament, 25,000. We've got over 5,000 in Greek, almost 6,000 of them in Greek, 10,000 in the Latin Vulgate, and about 9,300 others. So there are plenty of manuscripts supporting our New Testament. Let's compare this to Shakespeare. Last week we talked about Shakespeare. The world likes Shakespeare as a whole, right? The world will tell you that Shakespeare was a wonderful writer and he wrote however many plays and such. We talked about that last week. There are no known manuscripts of any of Shakespeare's writing. None. But yet, the world will believe that Shakespeare was wonderful and that he wrote his own work. But again, there are no known manuscripts of any of his writing. Again, we've got over 25,000 manuscripts of the New Testament alone. When we compare biblical manuscripts to other ancient writings, none have such a small gap of time from the time they were written until the earliest manuscript. That means if I wrote something in 1980 and the earliest manuscript that was found of my writing was in 2000, that's a 20-year age gap, right? That's a 20-year gap of time from the time it was written until the earliest manuscript. If there are other manuscripts discovered from something I wrote, right, and those are from latter years, then that gap changes, right? So there is such a small gap from the time written till the time of the earliest manuscripts for the New Testament, okay? We have tons of manuscripts for the Old Testament and the New Testament. None have such a small gap of time from the time written until the earliest manuscripts as some of the Old Testament. That means the latter ones of the Old Testament, right? The Old Testament was written over a very long period of time. So the latter portion of the Old Testament, Chronicles and such, until the most of the New Testament. So let's get into that. Let me show you what I'm talking about, because I know it sounds strange. I get that. Let me show you. There's a chart comparing ancient manuscripts. And I want you to pay attention to this chart, because here there are well-known writers, right? We've all heard of Homer and the Iliad. We talked about it early in high school or middle school, right? It was what, the longest poem ever written. He wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. We've heard of Plato. We've heard of Caesar. We've heard of Aristotle, right? I want you to look at the date their works were written. So if we look at Homer, he wrote the Iliad around 800 BC, right? The earliest copies that have been found were around 400 BC. That's a 400-year time gap between the time the Iliad was written until the earliest manuscript copies, right? And then we have only 643 copies that have been found. Okay, so look at Herodotus. He wrote history between 480 and 425 BC. The earliest copies of his manuscript were found around AD 900. That's about 1,350-year time gap between the date written until the earliest manuscripts, the oldest ones. That means the oldest ones they could find. And guess what? Only discovered 8 of them. Now, I'm not going to go through line by line through this list, but if you look at Aristotle. 450 to 385 BC is when he wrote some of his work. The earliest manuscripts were found around AD 1100. That's a 1,400-year gap of time. That means not in your lifetime, your mother's, your grandmother's, your great-grandmother's, right? This is a long period of time, and only 49 of any one work was found. Now let's look at the Old Testament, written between 800 and 400 BC. Earliest manuscripts were found between 250 and 200 BC. So that's a 150-year time gap. So that is from that 150 years is, of course, from 400 BC, the latter part of the Old Testament, to 250 BC when it was found. Okay. So that's 150 years just for that part of the Old Testament, right? So if we're looking at the earliest part of the Old Testament, 800, of course, that gap of time becomes larger. 14,000 copies of the Old Testament found. 14,000 plus, okay? And these are pieces of them. I'm in class, you gotta get out. Sorry about that. If we look at the New Testament written between AD 50 and 100. And there are all types of pieces of the earliest copies of the New Testament, all types of fragments, 114 fragments, 200 books, all these different types of parts of the New Testament, and then complete copies. And here you see 50 years. That's a very short amount of time. 100 years, 150, even at 225 years. We see here from this chart that the Bible itself, between the Old Testament and the New Testament, is still the shortest amount of time gap from any of these other ancient writers. And look how many manuscripts we have, how many copies? 14,000 the Old Testament and over 5,000 New Testament. And that's just Greek, right? So this 5366, and again, these numbers, please don't take these numbers exactly precisely to heart, right? It depends on which website or which book. These numbers will vary, okay? That's what we call a variance. And they're not significant differences. All the numbers I've seen have been in the 5,000s for Greek. So this number, this 5,366, that's Greek, okay? Because remember on the previous chart, we talked about the Latin and other copies. So we've got over 25,000 copies of the New Testament in various languages. This 5,366 is just Greek. Okay. Any questions on this chart? Sister Paulette, if you're talking, I cannot hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yes,
What
ma'am.
is the difference between BC and AD, and which one comes first?
BC is before Christ.
Okay.
AD is considered we commonly say after death, but that's not what it really stands for. You're going to make me look it up. But AD is referenced during the time of Christ. BC is before Christ. Before Common Era is what?
I think it's Anno Domini. Anno.
It's something like that.
BC.
That sounds about right.
AD.
Thank you.
Anno Domini. In the year of the Lord. Used to show that a year is after the year in which Jesus Christ is thought to have been born. Now, this is what Google says, thought to have been born. We know he was born. Anno Domini. Sometimes you'll see BC is like BCE, before Common Era, and they'll have AD as in Common Era. And that's what the secular world will use. Okay, any other questions on this chart? The purpose of this chart and why I put it in here is just to show the significance of the number of manuscripts, for one, because these are facts and these are proof, right? We go by proof, right? So the number of manuscripts we have verify that the Bible we have has not changed. These manuscripts are almost identical. What do I mean by that? There are variances between them, but nothing that would change salvation, right? The spelling of Isaiah may be different. One might have an I for Isaiah, one might have an E. We see that in the New Testament, right? So those are variances. Those are things that are different per se. Same person, different spelling, but it has nothing to do with salvation. How many of y'all have your name misspelled? My name's been misspelled my entire life. I'm still the same person, right? I mean, my sister and I, sometimes people put combinations of both of our names and it's like a new person. I'm like, well, I don't know which one of us you meant. Same person. That's what I mean by variances, right? So we have variances in the various copies of the New Testament and the Old Testament, and we'll get into that a little bit about textual criticism, but nothing that changes salvation. So when people say the Bible contradicts itself or there are errors in the Bible, nope, not true. We know scripture interprets scripture and there's no errors, because that would mean that God created errors and that he is in error and he is not. All right, next slide. Biblical canon. Okay, so what is the canon? I've got to make, I got to go back. Sorry. Okay, what is the canon? Canon comes from the root word read. The Greek word is canon and the Hebrew word is kana. And please excuse me if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. It is used as a type of measuring rod, and it came to mean standard. Things that have been measured for acceptance. So it is a standard of doing things. When you do it this way, this is how it is. And the way I thought about it was, here in the US, we have ISO standards, right? And those are a way of doing things here in the US. And that's how, actually, I think it's an international standard, but it's the way we standardize the way things are done. ISOs are internationally agreed by experts, quality management standards to help work more efficiently and reduce product failures. So it is a standard way of doing things. So this class is not about ISO standards, but it's to give you an example, because a lot of people have heard of that. The biblical canon was a standard way to vet what was going to be in the Old Testament or New Testament. It was a measuring rod. It was made, it was a standard of how to decide what was going to be in the Bible. So I say that to say the church did not create the canon. The church recognized it. Okay, canon can be used for lots of things, not just the Bible. Remember, it's a standard. It is a measuring rod. It is the way of doing things, a measure of acceptance. Think about cars. Your cars have to go through all kinds of tests before they are deemed safe. And they have to go through so many inspections. If you buy a car that's used certified, you know the fact that it's certified means it went through this 50-point inspection test or whatever it is that dealership does. That is their quality of standard. That is their way of saying this has been vetted. It is safe. It is okay. If it's not certified, then you know what? It did not meet our stamp of approval. Okay? To trust the Bible as God's authoritative word, it must be transmitted accurately from the time it was written. Now, we know the Bible was transmitted accurately from the time it was written because we've got lots and lots of manuscripts that agree. And must have accurate historical accounts of people, places, and events. We know our Bible does that, and we're going to get more in detail about that in some of the latter classes discussing artifacts that have been discovered that prove the people, places, and events that are listed in the Bible. The Bible must have revelations from God that exclude scientific jargon that would give the appearance of human authorship. And we talked about that last week, right? So the Bible doesn't have a bunch of words in it that make it sound like a scientist from the CDC wrote it, right? Or somebody that's writing about COVID-19. There's none of those words in there that would give the appearance that some scientist made this up, okay? The biblical canon is a fixed list. No books can be added nor taken away. You should know that. You should 100% be aware that our Bibles cannot change. It is fixed. No books added, no books taken away. Any questions before we move on? Nope. Okay, let's keep it moving.
Sorry, I do have one.
Yes, ma'am.
When they put the Bible in so many different translations, does it change the meaning?
We're going to talk about that.
Oh, okay.
We are absolutely going to talk about that. So, it should not change the meaning. However, we know all English translations of the Bible do not use the same words, and some of them appear to change the meaning. And we're going to talk about why they appear that way. Okay, we're going to talk about that.
Thank you.
It's almost like you read my mind and got ahead of my slides.
These are things I was concerned with all along.
We're going to talk about it, and I hope that you will become smarter afterwards. We're going to talk about exactly that. That's why I'm giving you the background now, because we're going to talk about the English translations of the Bible. All of this is important because these are things that people will challenge you on. Old Testament canon. So there was an Old Testament canon and a New Testament canon that collectively made the biblical canon. And a lot of times when we hear about the canon, we just hear about the biblical canon. We are not aware that there was two. There was an Old Testament canon and a New Testament canon. So there is a theory, the Yamina theory, that says a group of rabbis met at Yamina near Jaffa. And this group did not decide the Hebrew canon. So there is rumors out there that this group did, but they did not. The primary purpose of this group, the Yamina theory, this group of rabbis, was to argue for certain books staying in the canon and not adding new ones. Okay, the argument was for them to stay in. Esther was questioned due to it not mentioning God. So Esther is the one book in the Old Testament that does not mention God. So it was questioned whether it was going to stay in. There was no mention of adding new books to the canon. The Hebrew canon was established around 400 to 150 BC. Now, there were other books in question also, but that was quite interesting to me. The Hebrew canon, again, was established around 400 to 150 BC. The Jews believed that from the 4th century onward, God stopped speaking. So the last books of the Hebrew canon were Malachi and Chronicles. Those were the last books written. Books written after this time may provide life lessons, but are not considered canonical. Does anybody know why they believe that God stopped speaking after Malachi and Chronicles? Nobody? This is an easy.
Sin.
No, it's even simpler than that. Because Matthew tells you that it was quiet for 400 years.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yes.
There was nothing. The prophets stopped talking. So there was nothing. Matthew tells you it was quiet for 400 years. Literally, God stopped speaking to them. So all the books after Malachi, or the supposed books, they're not considered part of the canon because they're not inspired by God. He didn't tell them to write it. This was not the voice of the Lord. So they were not considered canonical. Okay? It is unknown when the Hebrew canon was established, right? So we've got here, it was between 400 and 150 BC. We're unclear as to exactly when and what that process was. What we do know is that there was a Hebrew canon, and it's clear because Luke 24 and 44 tells us. So let's go there real quick. And he said unto them, and this is Jesus, these are the words which I spake unto you while I was yet with you, that all things must be fulfilled which were written in the law of Moses and in the prophets and in the Psalms concerning me. What was the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms?
The Old Testament.
Absolutely, the Old Testament. Very good. The Old Testament. So that tells us right there that the Old Testament canon was established before Jesus because he talked about it. So we know there was a canon, and we know that it was in place and it was read and distributed amongst the Jews during
because Jesus came here to fulfill all those things.
Absolutely.
During his lifetime.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we don't know exactly when it was established, but we know it was established and it was there and it was well known and distributed. No human authority and no council of rabbis ever made an Old Testament book authoritative. These books were inspired by God and had the stamp of authority on them from the beginning. Okay, so the Council of Yamina, the Yamina theory, none of these other meetings or anything, they did not make the books authoritative. They were already authoritative because they were inspired by God. This is why anything written after Malachi and Chronicles, between them and between Matthew, non-canonical. Because guess what? They were not considered inspired by God. Because the voice of the Lord stopped talking. God stopped talking. Any questions before I move on?
Yes. Would it be incorrect when you're asking about the Old Testament canon, if we said, instead of the law, if we said Torah, would that be wrong?
No. Okay. No. That's fine. We know the Torah was the Hebrew first 5 books. So yes. That's fine. That's fine. All right, moving forward. New Testament canon. So remember, I told you there was an Old Testament canon and a New Testament canon that collectively made the biblical canon. There was a need for a New Testament canon because misinformation was being spread by counterfeit writings, right? So there were people that were false prophets. And we read about this in the New Testament, right? There were people going and spreading lies. Remember, they were saying that Jesus' disciples had stolen by night, right? So that was rumored. There were people that were false prophets and preaching other things other than what Jesus taught. So there was a need to put a stamp of approval on the New Testament. The primary test, now there were several things that the New Testament had to have in order to be considered canonical, and I did not list all of them, but the primary test was for divine inspiration. That means apostolicity, apostolic authority or approval. Again, I'm going to say that again because this is important. Divine inspiration was the primary test for the New Testament. Apostolicity, it means apostolic authority or approval. This is important. The New Testament was recognized by ancient historians also, not only the apostles and their followers. So, Athanasius recognized the New Testament. He had an early list of New Testament books. Polycarp, Clemente of Alexandria, he was very well known, right? Then there was Josephus, right? There was a lot of ancient historians who attested to the New Testament. Church councils, the Synod of Hippo around AD 393, again, did not confer authority, but recorded already established canonicity, right? So the reason I'm telling you about these ones that were not it is because you'll find a lot of readings that say the Yamina theory is what created the canon for the Old Testament, and that's not so. The Synod of Hippo did not create the canon for the New Testament. Okay. One of the first New Testament canons we see in history comes from the 2nd century heretic Marcion. He was a radical who accepted Paul as the only uncorrupted apostle, and so accepted only the Pauline epistles. Now, this was one version of the canon. We know our New Testament canon does include more than the Pauline epistles, but this is how Paul's writings were valued. So there were several iterations the New Testament canon went through, and Marcion's was one of them. I put a link here to Apologetics Press. You can read the whole article if you so choose. But the canon went through many phases, and we got to where we are now. Again, the canon is a standard. It was a measuring stick, right? There were certain things these books, these letters had to have in order for them to be validated as divinely inspired. This is important. Again, there are other writings out there. Guess what? They're not part of our Bibles. They did not stand the test. Textual criticism of the Old Testament. Copies of the Old Testament manuscripts were kept and transcribed meticulously. Remember, the Old Testament was written a very, very long time ago. I have tried to put this list in chronological order, and it was a challenge. Dead Sea Scrolls. Who can tell me something about the Dead Sea Scrolls?
They were found about 1946 in caves, in clay jars. I think the first one was found by a young boy when he heard a ping when he was throwing stones into the cave. And that's what started. And they were fragments of papyrus, and they had to be treated scientifically to open them because they were so old. And people realized, historians and anthropologists and specialists understood the meaning, and they spent years and years and years putting the fragments together, and still are doing it.
Absolutely. Very
And,
good
other,
synopsis.
and I also believe they were located in 11 different caves. They
Yes,
found these different
absolutely.
things in.
Yep.
Absolutely. Hands down, the Dead Sea Scrolls were the biggest discovery and contribution to our Old Testament um, Bibles, our Old Testament. The reason I say that because once those were discovered, they predated everything else that we had. Now, remember, we had other manuscripts, but once the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because they were found near the Dead Sea in Qumran in caves, right? Sometimes they're called discoveries in the Judean desert. There's lots of books and documentaries on the History Channel and stuff about this. I mean, there is a large amount of information, but this was a huge discovery. There were tons and tons of fragments of pieces of the Old Testament. In fact, I want to say there was a piece of every single book of the Old Testament except Esther in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think that's true. I think I remember reading that they found everything except Esther, pieces of every book of the Old Testament. Now we know Esther was found in other places as well, so I don't want to say that Esther does not belong in the Bible, because that is not what I'm saying at all. Please don't misunderstand me. Dead Sea Scrolls, huge discovery. Huge. Again, this discovery predated everything we previously had. Okay. Huge for Christianity. Very big. Now, there were other non-Christian discoveries also, but very significant to our Old Testament. The Samaritan Pentateuch was written in Hebrew and contains only the Pentateuch preserved by the Samaritan community. So the Samaritans are a sect related to Judaism, primarily known for their having their own temple on Mount Gerizim rather than worshiping at the temple in Jerusalem. We know the Samaritans and the other Jews didn't so much get along. And so the Samaritan Pentateuch favors their point of view. And the writings favor worshiping at Mount Gerizim rather than Jerusalem. So if you ever get a chance to read an English version of the Samaritan Pentateuch, the variance, again, this is the variance you will see is that it'll say the temple at Mount Gerizim rather than Jerusalem. Okay. Again, this is not a salvation thing. So this is a variance you'll see. And this is why I say the Bible does not contradict itself, and these ancient manuscripts do not contradict themselves. There are variances in them. Okay. Remember I said the spelling of Isaiah may be different. Where they're worshiping, Mount Gerizim or Jerusalem, that's a difference. Salvation does not change between these manuscripts. We've got the Septuagint, right? The abbreviation for it is LXX. It's in Greek. And the story is there are about 72 scholars that traveled to Alexandria, Egypt, to translate the Pentateuch from Hebrew to Greek. That is the abbreviated version of the story. But the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Then we have the Masoretic text. It's in Hebrew. The Masoretes were a group of people who used something called a Masorah, and it was attached to the Hebrew text type to aid in accurate transmission. It was very carefully preserved and transmitted. Every dot, every what does the scripture say? Every dot and tittle, is it? It was very, very, very meticulously transmitted. I mean, if you think of penmanship. It had to be exact. So you know how you read some folks write and we call it chicken scratch because it's so horrible and you can't tell what it says,
Mhm.
right? That would never have flown with the Masoretes. In fact, that would never have worked out with any of the Old Testament scrolls and papyrus and everything they wrote on was kept meticulously. I mean, I cannot stress that enough. This is why when we look at the different versions between the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Masoretic text, there are variances, but the meat of it is the same. There's no contradictions. Was someone going to say something? I thought I heard something. Aside from my children giggling. Okay. I can't stress enough that there are variances, but nothing that changes salvation in any of these versions. Old Testament was kept meticulously. I mean, there are others after these, but these are the ones, the oldest, okay? I've got an article here, one from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is very interesting, or at least to me it is, because these were rather recent discoveries. 1947 really wasn't that long ago, right? Especially if we're talking about discoveries from Old Testament times, 800 BC for Genesis, right? So we're talking about discoveries in 1947, and you can still see pieces of these fragments and pieces of the papyri and make out what it is. That's amazing. God preserved his word, I'm telling y'all. Preserved it so that we have something to stand on today and say, yep, what's in my Bible is the same thing that they found in those caves. This is why God allowed those discoveries to take place and why his word has been preserved. Again, it's been meticulously preserved over the years. I've got an article here for scientists finally read the oldest biblical text ever found. And that's an article from 2016, which really wasn't that long ago. In your leisure, please click on that and take a look. New Testament textual criticism. So we talked about the Old Testament. Let's talk about the New. How can you trust the New Testament when the original manuscripts are so different? Well, there's an article there. I encourage you to take a look. Here I have a list of various papyri that were found that give validity to the New Testament. Parts of John in Greek, discovered in an ancient garbage dump in Egypt, right? Parts of Matthew were found, fragments of Revelation, parts of John, and you can Google these and see what it looks like. It is really fascinating to see these. And then I've got an article here about, has the Bible been transmitted to us accurately? Anybody want to take a guess at what the answer is? Yeah, you're right, Sister Julie. It's yes. And why has it been transmitted accurately? Well, I just told you. It's been kept meticulously, especially from the Old Testament and the New Testament as well. I don't want to minimize the New Testament. Our Bibles have been kept meticulously. There are more manuscripts of the New Testament than any other book, hands down. So yes, our Bible has been transmitted to us accurately. Because again, there's no contradictions and no mistakes in the Bible. Let's talk a little bit more about New Testament. Published Greek texts. So there's several published Greek texts of the of the New Testament. There is what is called the critical text. And this is the Alexandrian text type, named after Alexandria, Egypt, where it was found. The two largest ones that you need to know about are the United Bible Societies, and that is the Greek New Testament 5th edition, and the Nestle Aland's Novum Testamentum Grace 28th edition. And I'll tell you, I ordered that one off of Amazon because they said that it was an English version of it, and I received it, and I will tell you, it was not in English. Parts of it were in Greek, and parts of it, I could not read it. I had to send it back. I wanted it for my own edification, and I wanted to see how it differed from the Byzantine text type, and I couldn't do anything with it. So I had to send it back. But if you know enough Greek, and you can Google and find all the other languages it is written in, I would encourage you to take a look at it. Then we have the majority text, which is considered the Byzantine text type. This is where about 80 to 90% of the 5,700 Greek manuscripts are part of the Byzantine text type. Remember, I said there were over 5,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. And again, this number, 5,700, that number will change depending on what website you look at. So don't get hung up on the exact number. I think on the slide before it was, what, 5,366 or something? Don't get hung up on the exact number. That number will change depending on how many pieces of the fragments they're counting and such. That does not change. That's a variance. That does not change the significance of over 5,000 manuscripts. Okay, to be clear. So if anyone wants to argue with you about that number, that didn't mean anything. Okay, 80 to 90% of the Greek manuscripts that we have are of the Byzantine text type. That's the majority text. The New Testament in the original Greek, according to the Byzantine majority text form, edited by Robinson and Pierpoint. Okay, that's an important one to have in your collection if you so desire. Then the Greek New Testament, according to the majority text, edited by Hodges and Farstad. Note, the Textus Receptus is based on the Byzantine text type, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the Textus Receptus. No documents of the ancient period are as well attested bibliographically as the New Testament. And we talked about that a minute ago because we have so many manuscripts. That's our bibliography. That's our proof. We have tons of manuscripts. We've got over 5,000 in Greek alone. We are going to talk a little bit more about textual criticism, the New Testament, okay? This is important, critical text and majority text. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. Anybody got questions about this or want to add to it? Does anyone have a clue what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
You do? Okay, thank you, Sister Julie.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any questions? I think I'll get to the next slide, and that might be a good stopping point. If we compare New Testament text types, so if we're looking at just the Byzantine and the Alexandrian text type, remember that's the majority text and the critical text. Now, I know there's a Western one on the slide, but we're not going to talk about Western, okay? We're just going to talk about Byzantine and Alexandrian. Over 5,000 manuscripts or portion of manuscripts are of the Byzantine. We talked about that a minute ago. That's the majority text, right? Only about 200 or so are of the Alexandrian. That's the critical text. Here you can see the dates. The earliest date is the 4th century for the Byzantine. The earliest date is the 2nd century for the Alexandrian. This is interesting because from looking at this chart, the Alexandrian text type is older than the Byzantine. However, we have lots more manuscripts of the Byzantine than the Alexandrian. Again, are we looking at date, what's older versus what's newer, or are we looking at by multitude? We have lots more copies of the Byzantine text type. Okay. If we look at English translations of the Bible, the King James, the New King James, MKJV, and the Geneva Bible are all of the Byzantine text type. Then for the Alexandrian, which is the critical text, we've got the RSV, the ESV, the NASB, the NIV, J&D, New Living Translation, HCSB, and the Message Bibles. These text types for the Byzantine are named Byzantine because that's close to the location where the New Testament texts were found. That's why they call it the Byzantine. It's also called the majority text because the majority of the manuscripts are of the Byzantine text type. The Alexandrian text type is called that because it's close to the date when the New Testament was written. Now, these were also found near Alexandria, Egypt. This agreement among the texts is the norm for the Byzantine, and textual variants do not agree with each other in the Alexandrian. So you've got people that'll say they love the majority text, or they love the critical text, or they love the Byzantine or the Alexandrian. And there are people that will have their favorites. Okay, their favorites are normally, what English version of the Bible they're reading. And that version of the Bible is their New Testament is based off of one of these text types. I'm going to stop right there for today, because what I'm going to do next week, I'm going to pick back up on this same slide, because this will reintroduce you to what we're going to talk about next week, because we're going to go into a chart of the, I'm going to show you a chart of the English Bible translations, what Sister Paulette was asking, and what text type that version of the Bible is based on, right? So if you are a King James person, you will see what text type the King James is based off. If you're an NIV person, you will see the lineage of that one. Okay, does that make sense? I mean, I'm going to show you the chart next week, but we're going to talk about, remember, our Bibles were not written in English. What we have are English translations of a Bible that was originally in ancient Hebrew, Koine Greek, Aramaic, okay? They were translated, okay? NIV and 1 Corinthians will say love. King James says charity. Has nothing to do with salvation. It's just a different word, right? Okay. All right. With that said, any questions over what we went over today? And I told you it's a lot of information. I will send out these charts, and I will stop it at this chart here. So I won't send you any further charts because I don't want to confuse you. Any questions? Yes, ma'am, Sister Julie.
Going back to the syllabus, I was reading and researching earlier the Council of Maya, M-Y-A. I searched everywhere. I mean, I know that we're not going by the syllabus, but it sparked my, like, what is this? I never remember hearing this before. And the only thing I could find that had anything to do with Council of Maya is a girls' organization. And
that's what I took. So we're not going to talk about the Council of Maya, because that
was it.
Couldn't find it either.
Yeah.
So it's a topic we were going to talk about. And again, I wrote this syllabus months ago.
Yeah.
And I could not find anything substantial.
Nothing. So, and I found the Council of Maya in Facebook about a girls' Christian camp or organization, that sort of thing. But nothing in any research engine that I tried came up with anything even close.
So I'll be honest with you all. That was a suggestion I got from Dr. Short, and I am convinced that I misheard him. I wrote down Council of Maya, and I haven't found anything regarding Council of Maya. So I am convinced I misunderstood him. So it's in the syllabus, but it will not be in our coursework. So you've been saved.
Well, I just thought it was, a bit of, a tidbit of unnecessary information.
Well, thank you for working ahead. For your enthusiasm. Any other questions regarding what we talked about today? Let me show you your homework. That would help.
Most of this is in chapter 4 and 5.
Yes.
Actually.
Okay, so I stopped on slide 11. Let's go to your homework. All right, submit a paper addressing the following questions. What is the difference between the apocrypha and the pseudepigrapha?
Oh, means non, yeah, that's easy.
Pseudo means false.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So you know right away.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I want you to tell me the difference between the two and why were these not included in the biblical canon?
Why not included in the canon?
Yes, ma'am. The difference between the two and why they were not included in the biblical canon. That is your week 3 homework. Remember, please address both of the questions I'm asking you. When I say what is the difference, I want you to tell me the difference between the two. Just don't tell me what they are, but tell me why they differ and why they were not included in the biblical canon. Please complete your thoughts. If you make a statement, give me something to back it up. Not just, well, they weren't included because they were not canonized. Well, yeah. Don't tell me that they were not included in the canon because they didn't meet the standard. Okay. Why didn't they meet the standard? Give me something behind that. Remember, you guys are great apologists. I am trying to make you into great apologists. Okay. Somebody will challenge you on some of this stuff one day if they haven't already. You get somebody that wants to save the whales and the hippos and stuff, they're going to tell you everything you need to know about saving hippos and whales and why you shouldn't use certain products with animal testing and why you shouldn't go fishing and whatever else. We have to be just as good when we talk about our Bibles and our Jesus. There are other religions out there that will tell you everything you never wanted to know about why they believe what they believe. We have to do the same. So again, give me something to back up your statements.
Mm-hmm.
Start reading chapters 6 and 7 in your book. Any questions? I want to get out of that. Any questions? Week 4, next week, we are going to continue what we started talking about this week. I am less concerned with you reading chapters 6 and 7 at this point, because again, these this lesson 3 and 4 are culminating. They're very similar, so I had to put them together. I am more concerned with you concentrating on your reading that was due this week and knowing that material because it will help support you in this week's assignment and next week's assignment. Any questions? I will send out these charts shortly, and I will make sure when Dr. Short sends me the recording that I forward it to all of you. So I apologize about last week. When he sent me the recording, I did not pay attention to the to line. So I did not realize that you all did not receive the recording until a few days later when I think it was Sister Paulette or somebody asked me about the recording. And I thought to myself, well, gosh, Dr. Short sent it a few days ago. I went back and looked at the email and I was the only one on it. So I apologize. I will make sure that you all receive the link for the recording tonight. And I will send you all the slides for all the information that we talked about in class tonight. Remember, do not look at your syllabus for the homework assignment. Look at the chart I just showed you. Look at what we talked about in class today. Okay? With that said, we'll close out in prayer. Lord, we thank you for this class. We thank you for the material that was presented. We ask that you open up everyone's understanding, Lord God, that the information is clear and concise. Give us the illumination that you have for us, that we can be great apologists, Lord God, that we can defend what we believe and in whom we believe, and we can do it well. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, everybody, have a wonderful week. As always, email me, text me, call me if you have any questions, and I am here to help.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent job.
Good
Yeah.
night.
Good
Our
night.
internet's
Have
lasting.
a
Thank
wonderful
you.
week.
Right.
Right. Good night.
Night, everyone.
A great weekend.
Good night.